Journal, and this is us getting into conversations on lactose intolerance. So, if you've ever felt bloated or uncomfortable after having milk or other dairy products, you may be wondering, could I be lactose intolerant? This is a question that many people ask, particularly given how common lactose intolerance is believed to be amongst African adults as you and I speak. But what exactly is happening in our bodies when we experience these symptoms? Does lactose intolerance mean we have to give up all types of dairy, or just certain types of dairy is the question. So today we're going to be, really looking at these questions, the frequently asked ones when it comes to lactose and our physical well-being. Leanne Kiezer is joining me in her capacity as a registered dietitian and head of public affairs at Danone, Southern Africa. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Mateko. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. A very important conversation that continues to be of debate, because also we're seeing so many different products. I mean, just the other day when I was doing my own grocery shopping, I saw a block of cheese and it was written lactose free. And I was like, okay, well, what's that? But you're going to help us answer all these questions. First of all, what is lactose? And why is it that some people are allergic to it or intolerant to it, and others are able to be more tolerant with it, as it were?
Yes, thank you so much. I love the opportunity to talk about this, especially in the African context, right? Because the prevalence of lactose intolerance is really high on our continent. We estimate that about 80% of Africans experience some degree of lactose intolerance. And so understanding what it is, understanding what's going on in your body, and then understanding what are the dietary steps to treat it is absolutely critical. So yes, your first question is, what is lactose intolerance? What are we talking about here? So in the process of digestion, everybody has a enzyme in their body which is called lactase. And when you consume milk, the naturally occurring carbohydrate or sugar in the milk is called lactose. And humans, as part of digestion, need the enzyme lactase to be able to digest and break down lactose. But what happens with lactose intolerance is that people don't have a full amount of lactase, or that digesting enzyme that they really should have in their bodies. So they are kind of compromised. They might have lower levels of lactase or lactase or no lactase altogether. And then that means that when that person consumes milk, they struggle to break down and digest the lactose, which is the sugar found in milk. And then we can experience certain symptoms of that, right? So it's not an allergy as such, but you can definitely experience some discomfort. For example, some bloating, stomach aches, distension of the abdomen, definitely a bit of discomfort there. But what's important to know about that is that a lactose intolerance is quite different from a dairy allergy, which is something altogether different. So a dairy allergy means that your immune system is having an allergic reaction to the protein that you find in cow's milk. And when it comes to a dairy allergy, if you've been diagnosed with a cow's milk allergy, people often think that they have this, but the best is to get a diagnosis so that you know for sure, then absolutely there's no question. If you have a diagnosed cow's milk allergy, you should exclude cow's milk out of your diet altogether. But on the scope of lactose intolerance, the word tolerance is important because it implies that you can usually tolerate a certain amount of lactose when you consume it, depending on how much of that enzyme lactase you have in your body. And so a lot of people, when they have lactose intolerance, cut dairy out of their diets altogether. And that's actually not the recommended approach, because when you do that, you cut out all of the nutrient benefits that you could be getting from your dairy products, when actually, depending on your tolerance levels and the amount of lactase you have in your body, there are ways that you could consume those dairy products, get their nutritional benefits, and avoid any discomfort and any distension or any bloating that might occur just because you're aware of the tolerance topic. I'll give an example of this. So, sometimes you might wake up in the morning and drink a nice big, maybe cappuccino, and it's got a lot of milk in it, and it's about 400 mils of milk in your standard mug of cappuccino. And in that case, that's a lot of lactose to take in a short space of time, which indeed might exceed the tolerance level that you have. But it doesn't mean you need to cut out milk altogether. It might just mean that you need to rethink your morning beverage choice and go for something with a slightly lower milk content. And if you space your milk intake evenly throughout the day, instead of having big, massive doses in short spaces of time, that is one way that professionals recommend that you can enjoy the benefits of dairy without experiencing the discomfort.
Okay, I mean, this is a lot of information to take in, and I'm starting to think now: is it in how the dairy products and the milks are processed these days? I was watching a very interesting video over the weekend with a gentleman who does food research, and he's a food traveler, and he goes into indigenous places and rural areas and sees how they process their own food. And one of the episodes, he was in one of the villages where the women there are traditionally making buttermilk and sort of sifting that out and making their own cultured butters. It was very, very fascinating. So is it that the way that milk and milk products are being processed today is making people sick?
Absolutely not. I would not agree with that. But you've touched on something really important, which is an interesting lesson. And that is that milk in general, milk which has kind of been processed but not inoculated with bacteria or live cultures or become cultured, milk on its own generally has a higher lactose content than your cultured or fermented products. So, for example, milk, mass, fermented milk, cultured milks, buttermilks, because yogurt and buttered milks and cultured milks have bacteria added to them. The fascinating part is that the bacteria actually works on the milk, and as part of the process of producing the end product of yogurt, mass, or cultured milk, it digests the lactose which is occurring in that milk. So usually your buttered milk, your cultured milk, your mass, and your yogurt have a lower lactose content than your original milk does, because the bacteria that we use to make those products digests a portion of the lactose in the milk. And so one of the recommendations that we make for people with lactose intolerance is that instead of cutting dairy out altogether, number one, you could consider having smaller doses throughout the day, which we mentioned already. But number two, which is key, is that you rather choose cultured milk products, yogurt, mass, cultured milk, buttered milk, instead of the original sort of fresh milk products, because naturally the lower lactose content is lower, and so you're more likely to be able to tolerate it. And then if we go that way around, your question makes perfect sense, because our traditional method of preparing milk products, especially in Africa, is to ferment milk. And this is actually a process of fermentation, is a long, ancient, traditional method that we've always adopted and used. And it's been easier for us to tolerate that milk because the lactose content is lower. But it's not necessarily to do with processing. It's actually to do with the activity of those beautiful bacteria that we add to the milk product that in the end produces a cultured yogurt, cultured milk, or a mass.
All right. Okay. Well, I mean, thank you for that. I'm glad I asked that question, because this is a part of the purpose of these types of conversations, is really to debunk the myths and for us not to assume certain things, but to really get the evidence based information around milk and dairy products, as it were. On the line with me is Leanne Kiezer. She is a registered dietitian and head of public affairs at Danone, Southern Africa. We continue with the most frequently asked questions on lactose and milk after this.
Africa Update on Channel Africa with Lulu Kabu.
The Alexandra Regional Court in Johannesburg, South Africa, has sentenced Bellarmine Mugabe to 24 months in prison or a $24,000 fine for pointing a toy firearm, as well as 18 months imprisonment or a $12,000 fine for being in the country illegally. Meanwhile, his co-accused Tobias Matuhodze has been sentenced to 3 years imprisonment.
So basically what the magistrate said was that, he has taken into consideration that the complainant or the victim did in fact withdraw the charges. So both of the accused will actually have to be deported. He is to be escorted by the investigating officer. However, in terms of Matonze, he will in fact have to serve his prison time, and thereafter he will in fact also be deported back to Zimbabwe.
Africa Update with Lulu Kabu, 12 to 1 p.m. Central African Time.
A legacy isn't a statue or a name carved in a stone. A legacy lives in what people do next. Mandela Month on Channel Africa. Every headline has a human side. The Journal with Matseko Musito on the African Perspective.
We continue our conversation looking at lactose and lactose intolerance. Does it mean that you have to give up dairy altogether? Are some dairy products easier to digest than others? And how do we know whether what we're experiencing is lactose intolerance or perhaps something else altogether? Well, these are some of the questions that we're addressing with our expert who joins me on the line in her capacity as a registered dietitian and head of public affairs at Danone Southern Africa, Leanne. So she deals with dairy a lot, okay? She knows the ins and outs of this particular conversation. Leanne, I have a bit of a loaded question. I think you may have touched on it a little bit, but let's talk about what research tells us, especially when it comes to overall health and nutrition. And we're seeing with new evidence and new research that's coming up with the different doctors that are dealing with different aspects of health and the complexity of one's physiology, is food groups seem to be changing. We have a whole lot of different food groups now compared to what we used to see in the 80s, which was just one standard, food chain, and that was that, right? So the loaded question is it safe to remove an entire food group? And in this context, dairy. Or do I need to go through severe blood tests to be able to determine whether I should completely stay away from dairy, or is it just as listening to my body? And if it's making sounds and making myself and other people uncomfortable, maybe it's time to stop. When do I know what to do?
Yeah. So I love your question because, nutrition science is evolving all the time. And it's important that we realize that, because as more and more research comes to light, so the guidelines that we give to the public need to change and evolve. And it's true, things do change over time. A few years ago, we used to recommend that one shouldn't eat too many eggs, for example, because we thought that would contribute to cholesterol. And now the guideline is that you can have an egg a day safely. So it does, it evolves and changes, and we expect that to happen as and when new science emerges. So yes, your point is good that the food groups, as we know them to be, kind of have been flipped on their head in the most recent science. I'm sure many of us are familiar with something we call the food pyramid, and it used to say at the top were the foods that we should eat the least of, and at the bottom are the foods we should eat the most of. And now those food groups are, reshuffled into a completely different place in the pyramid. But I think there is a few things we could say which are a good rule of thumb. And the rule of thumb is that variety when you are choosing your foods is critical. Because why? The different food groups each offer a different nutrient benefit, which is essential to your body. So the more diversity and variety you can include in your diet, the better. And it's for this reason that we don't recommend that people, jump to conclusions and do extreme approaches like cutting whole food groups out altogether. That is absolutely not recommended. But also, on top of the message of variety and diversity, we also need to remember the message of whole foods being key to your diet. So definitely, I think the dietary guidelines haven't changed on that subject, but 80% of what you're eating should be from whole foods or foods where you can recognize where that food came from in its original source. So otherwise said, the opposite of this message is only 20% of your diet should be coming from foods which are extremely ultra processed, foods where you can't recognize the original food source, the original fruit, vegetable, or so on. So if then we're focusing on a variety of foods, but most of them are our whole foods that we know exactly where they came from, what are they? We are talking concretely about fruits and vegetables, your protein foods like eggs, dairy, chicken, beef, fish, also your plant sources of protein, of course, like your nuts, your beans, your lentils. And these foods become essential to the diet. And so the second we start to consider cutting one of those out, you will be at risk of cutting out an essential source of nutrients to your diet. And the problem is also that because we know lactose intolerance has such a high prevalence, as I said, especially on the African continent, people have fallen into the trap of a bit of self-diagnosis. I also think, by the way, that Google and the access to the internet has probably also accelerated this because now people don't necessarily go to healthcare professionals for their health advice. They can just Google it or AI it, and then suddenly they get a whole panel of recommendations which weren't actually guided by a healthcare professional. And so people are readily self-diagnosing. And so we see a lot of people cutting dairy out of their diets. And the other one which comes up, by the way, is gluten and the topic of carbohydrates. And I mean, carbohydrates are also essential to your diet because they help to give you energy. And now people are cutting that entire food group out in the quest to avoid gluten. And as best I can, I would really like to encourage you to avoid that extremist approach of cutting all food groups out together. If you are experiencing discomfort in your abdomen, in your gut, there is probably a reason for that. And the best way to help you identify the cause of that is to consult with a healthcare professional. It could be a dietitian, it could be a nutritionist, it could be your GP. Perhaps the GP will refer you to the right person. And then the steps that you take is basically to follow what we call an elimination diet. So for 1 week, we avoid this food. For 1 week, we avoid another. And then slowly we introduce those foods back into the diet. And then when we experience discomfort, you'll be able to identify what the trigger food was. Then we know, okay, this food is probably a trigger, but what were the circumstances of that intake? Did I have a large amount in a small space of time? Like the cappuccino example we talked about earlier. Was I experiencing maybe like a bit of unwellness? Was I on antibiotics at the time when I consumed that food? Usually if you look at your food diary, you'll be able to identify and pinpoint the cause. And then instead of removing the whole food group in this extreme approach, you can identify exactly the context and the circumstances of that single food's intake and how it caused some discomfort in your body. So really, there will be cases, for example, where there can be a diagnosis. And then, as I say, for those people, then we have dietary protocols which will help you respond to that diagnosis. But to take these kind of drastic decisions without an actual diagnosis, you may be causing yourself more harm than good and eliminating food and nutrients when it's not actually called for.
Well, there you have it. I think that is your sign, if ever you needed one, to please consult with a healthcare provider that's closest to you, so that you can determine what the actual issues are. And also, in this day and age, there's bigger research now about how men and women now tolerate different types of dairies, and what types of dairies to prioritize, and gut health and hormonal health and mitochondrial recoveries in this modern day life, as we noted. So this has been incredibly informative. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you so much, Leanne.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. I am so proud of how I have handled this conversation. The old me would have just been like, "You're not a cow. Are you a cow? You shouldn't be drinking milk." But here we are, opening up ourselves to new information and learning as we move along. I hope this was helpful to you as much as it was to us here. It is 9:31. Fikile Lengwadi standing by with the latest sports.
Sport.